It is my own abiding sin that whenever I come upon a door, I must needs see what lies upon the further side. But certain doors are best left unopened. Aerea Targaryen went through such a door. Septon Barth's account ends there. He would never again touch upon the fate of Princess Aerea in any of his writings, and even these words would be sealed amongst his privy papers to remain undiscovered for almost 100 years. The horrors he had witnessed had a profound effect upon the Septon, however, exciting the very hunger for knowledge he called my own abiding sin. It was subsequent to this that Barth began the researches and investigations that would ultimately lead him to write Dragons, Worms, and Wyverns, Their Unnatural History.
Hey everyone, Crowfood's daughter here, and if you click this video, you have reached the Disputed Lands. In today's video, we will be examining something I mentioned in the Mechanisms of Magic livestream on Between Two Werewoods. In light of the new and somewhat disturbing accounts of Aerea Targaryen in Fire and Blood, we will be discussing what could be the origin of dragons. But before we do that, we need to first talk about Septon Barth and his body of work known as Unnatural History. Now let's get started. So, Septon Barth was a man of low birth and the son of a common blacksmith who was given to the faith at a young age. However, despite his humble beginnings, Septon Barth rose to one of the most powerful positions in the Seven Kingdoms, the Hand of the King. Interestingly, there have been various reasons kings have appointed a man as their hand. Some were chosen because they were flatterers, others powerful, others were trusted family members. One was just really good at making wildfire. Well, Septon Barth was really none of these. Instead, the reason he was chosen for this position was simply because he had a good head on his shoulders. As Fire and Blood puts it, Septon Barth was the wisest man ever to serve as Hand of the King. Basically, Heresies had appointed Septon Barth because of his natural gifts and his intellect. It had valued these above social standing, wealth, or power. According to the World Book, his brilliance made itself known, and in time he came to serve in the library at the Red Keep, tending to the king's books and records. There, King Heresies became acquainted with him, and soon named him Hand of the King. In addition to serving as Hand of the King, Septon Barth was also a scholar, and had penned at least one book and a few other works. However, even in the face of both his intelligence and his status as a man of the faith, many of the ideas mentioned in his writings were scoffed at by the Citadel, and during the reign of Baelor the Blessed, all of Barth's writings were declared heretical and destroyed. Regardless of the naysayers and proclamations of Baelor, the readers of A Song of Ice and Fire soon discovered something very peculiar in Barth's writings, and that peculiarity would be that he's generally right. If you were to actually examine what has been given to us by Barth, you will see that what information we do have consistently contains truth. For example, after consulting texts at Castle Black, Barth suggested that the children of the forest could speak with ravens, and taught the first men this skill, and the use of ravens as messengers is merely a degraded form of this historical use. Now, despite what the maesters of the Citadel and other naysayers might argue, Bloodraven himself has indeed confirmed this to be true. Do all the birds have singers in them? All, Lord Brynden said. It was the singers who taught the first men to send messages by raven. But in those days, the birds would speak the words. The trees remember, but men forget. And so now they write the messages on parchment and tie them round the feet of birds who have never shared their skin. In addition to his insight into the control of ravens, Septon Barth also had a good understanding of many foundational concepts related to sanitation and public health. Great works to improve King's Landing were also implemented. Drains and sewers and wells, especially, for Barth believed that fresh water and the flushing away of offal and waste were important to a city's health. While the concepts laid out in this passage may seem obvious to us, It seems Barth was ahead of his time with his understanding of disease transmission, and it was through this knowledge that improvements enhancing the overall sanitation of King's Landing were implemented. Septon Barth also put forth that the inconsistencies of the cycling of the seasons was a result of the higher mysteries and magic rather than natural causes. Regardless of this explanation being scoffed at by the Citadel, in 2005, our author had actually confirmed this hypothesis to be the case, explaining that the erratic length of seasons has what he described as a fantasy explanation, rather than one based on science. Septon Barth also suggested that dragons are neither male nor female, and are able to change their genders at will, which is something that Maester Aemon seems to agree with. What fools we were, who thought ourselves so wise. The error crept in from the translation. Dragons are neither male nor female. Barth saw the truth of that, but now one, and now the other, as changeable as flame. The language misled us all for 1,000 years. Daenerys is the one, born amidst salt and smoke. The dragons prove it. In addition to Maester Aemon's agreement in these assumptions, as it turns out, the concept of an animal's ability to change genders is rooted in reality and has real-life examples in a handful of amphibian, reptile, and aquatic species. So Barth's supposition that dragons can do the same is not a far-fetched claim, as there are actual real-world examples of this. And when paired with Maester Aemon's statement, it seems dragons being able to change genders may very well be the case. So you can see, it is somewhat thematic that despite what others may assert, Septon Barth is often right, and these are just a few examples. To get a full character analysis of Septon Barth, be sure to check out History of Westeros' episode that is linked below, where they provide a full analysis of his scholarly body of work. Of all the things Barth has written, we really only know of 3 works, 2 of which are described as fragmented treatises. The third work of Barth's appears to be his primary body of research, and is the most referenced within the series. This body of work is known as Dragons, Worms, and Wyverns, Their Unnatural History, which is sometimes simply referred to as a natural history. As it turns out, a natural history was catalyzed by his own curiosity when he witnessed the horrors of Aerea Targaryen's death, an incident that ignited his research into dragon lore, which brings us to yet another one of Barth's suppositions, the origin of dragons. According to the World Book, Barth had consulted various texts and legends that explained the origin of dragons, and considered many of them before coming to his own hypothesis. In Qarth, there is a legend that tells how dragons came from a second moon in the sky. From Asshai comes a legend that claims a nameless people tamed dragons in the shadow and brought them to Valyria before disappearing from history. The Valyrians, however, have their own explanation, claiming that dragons sprang forth from the great volcanoes of Valyria, known as the 14 Flames, and claim to possess blood ties to the creatures they once controlled. Sheltered there, amidst the great volcanic mountains known as the 14 Flames, were the Valyrians, who learned to tame dragons and make them the most fearsome weapon of war the world ever saw. The tales the Valyrians told themselves claimed they were descended from dragons and were kin to the ones they now controlled. Ultimately, after studying all the sources, Barth put forth his own hypothesis, that the blood mages of Valyria experimented with wyvern stock in order to create dragons. And there is evidence to support this claim, as the World Book mentions wyverns are closely related to dragons and are a match for them in all respects, save for 2. Wyverns cannot breathe fire, and they are generally smaller in size, with the largest wyverns topping out at a maximum of only 30 feet. Now, aside from wyverns, the text of A Feast for Crows also suggests firewyrms are closely related to dragons. Firewyrms. Some say they are akin to dragons, for worms breathe fire too. Instead of soaring through the sky, they bore through stone and soil. if the old tales can be believed, there were worms amongst the 14 flames, even before the dragons came. So, according to the kindly man, in addition to dragons, it is claimed there is only one other type of creature capable of breathing flame, the fireworm. Now, when we examine the full title of a natural history, we see that it is called Dragons, Worms, and Wyverns. They are natural history. From the title alone, we see that a connection between dragons and fireworms was inevitably drawn. And because of this, the fandom has deduced that a mixing of fireworm and wyvern stock through blood magic might have been exactly what Barth had suggested, as both creatures share several properties to dragons. What properties the wyvern lacks in size and combustion, the fireworm possesses, as these worms are able to grow to monstrous proportions and breathe fire. Then, when you examine the text and how the dragons are occasionally described, this possibility becomes even more feasible, because there have been more than a few times when dragons have been described as worms. For example, on Dragonstone, a fortress built during the time of the Valyrian freehold, we see the towers are mentioned as being fashioned in the likeness of dragons, and in A Storm of Swords, we learn the name of one of those dragon towers is called the Wind Worm. Caraxes, the mount of Daemon Targaryen, was given a nickname by the small folk, and that nickname was none other than the Blood Worm. Sunfyre is another great example, as this dragon was also described as a worm. Sunfyre had participated in one of the first major battles of the dance at Rook's Rest. Although Aegon and his mount emerged victorious, both were grievously wounded in the fight. Despite attempts to recover the injured dragon and move him to another site, Sunfyre was too heavy to be relocated and unable to fly with an injured wing. Instead, Sunfyre remained in the fields beyond Rook's Rest, crawling through the ashes, and was described as looking like some great golden worm. In addition to that description, there was also an attempt made on Sunfyre's life after Lord Moontoon had retaken Rook's Rest. According to the text, the would-be dragon slayers easily drove off the cordon of guards who had been left to feed, serve, and protect the dragon. But Sunfyre himself proved more formidable than expected. Dragons are awkward creatures on the ground, and his torn wing left the great golden worm unable to take to the air. The attackers expected to find the beast near death. Instead, they found him sleeping. But the clash of swords and the thunder of horses soon roused him, and the first spear to strike him provoked him to fury. Slimy with mud, twisting amongst the bones of countless sheep, Sunfyre writhed and coiled like a serpent, his tail lashing, sending blasts of golden flame at his attackers as he struggled to fly. So again, we see Sunfyre likened to a worm, but in addition to this, we also see him likened to a serpent. Now, what you may not be aware of is the connotation of what the word worm might represent. You see, our author uses a very specific spelling for the term fireworm, with a Y replacing the O. In fantasy literature, a worm, spelled W-Y-R-M, often denotes a serpent or snake-like creature, or a limbless dragon. And this use of the term in fantasy literature happens to be a nod to some ancient semantics. As it turns out, some of the earliest depictions of dragons were wingless. They were snake-like creatures. Examples of this include Fafnir of Norse mythology, the dragon depicted in Beowulf, and also many of the dragons of Chinese mythology. Because of this, the dragon of Beowulf was described as a worm, which means serpent in Old English, and is rooted in the term ormur of Old Norse, which also means a snake or mythological serpent. So, with Sunfyre being described as both a worm, spelled W-Y-R-M, and a serpent in this passage, you can see the relationship the author is placing on the two terms. Now, with that knowledge, in Daenerys 8 of A Dance with Dragons, Dany takes Quentyn to the pit where Viserion and Rhaegal are confined,
and she finds herself wondering if dragons are able to tunnel through rock like the firewyrms of old Valyria. Interestingly, the very next time we return to the pit, Quentyn is attempting to steal a dragon, and we find that dragons may indeed be capable of tunneling through rock, as Viserion has escaped from his chains and has made himself a cave which was described as a burrow in the rock. And in this very same chapter, we again see a similar metaphor being used, as Rhaegal is described as being like some great green serpent. Behind a fence of sharp black teeth, he glimpsed the furnace glow, the shimmer of a sleeping fire 100 times brighter than his torch. The head was larger than a horse's, and the neck stretched on and on, uncoiling like some great green serpent as the head rose, until those two glowing bronze eyes were staring down at him. When Daenerys is in Daznak's pit, we are yet again given another example of this snake-like description. Dany swung the lash at his scaled belly, back and forth until her arm began to ache. His long serpentine neck bent like an archer's bow. With a hiss, he spat black fire down at her. Dany darted beneath the flames, swinging the whip and shouting. So, when looking at the evidence at hand, with Septon Barth, not only do we have a man who is often right, and a trusted source of information suggesting this hypothesis, but we also have corroborations within the text revealing several comparisons that support his theory as well. In addition to all the comparisons, descriptions, and metaphors tying worms and serpent-like creatures to dragons, Fire and Blood gave us something of a smoking gun: the hatching of Lena Targaryen's dragon egg. Her parents' pride and pleasure quickly turned to ash, however. The dragon that wriggled from the egg was a monstrosity, a wingless worm, maggot-white and blind. Within moments of hatching, the creature turned upon the babe in her cradle and tore a bloody chunk from her arm. As Lena shrieked, Lord Oakenfist ripped the dragon off her, flung it to the floor, and hacked it to pieces. So, a wingless worm, maggot-white and blind. Although the description of a worm-like creature in itself is quite telling, there is something that you might not have noticed. If you recall, firewyrms are said to be subterranean, creatures said to bore through stone and soil. Now, if you've taken biology in the past, you will know that creatures who live in subterranean habitats that are void of any light are often found to have two features. They often lack pigment, and they are often eyeless, or they have vestigial eyes that are without function and blind, because eyesight and pigment are unnecessary in habitats that are completely void of light. This real-world concept happens to be one our author is well aware of, and has even incorporated into his world, as there are subterranean fish within the caves of Westeros that also have this feature, that are mentioned in Bloodraven's cave, and also the cave found within the Arianne sample chapter for the upcoming Winds of Winter. In fact, in another story entitled In the House of the Worm, our author had incorporated subterranean worms into that story and made sure to give them the pale white and eyeless features as well. So, because this is a concept our author has incorporated into his series, and it's also one that he's used in the past, this means there's a pretty good chance that the firewyrms who thrive in similar dark conditions may also be white and blind or eyeless. So, in the case of Lena's dragon, not only do we have an instance where a dragon is born wrong, without wings and described as a worm, but in addition to that, this dragon is also born maggot-white and blind. So what we are probably being given here, and what is probably being hinted at, is a dragon whose worm genetics had simply presented more physically. So, in addition to all the other information we had prior to the publication of Fire and Blood, with the account of Lena Targaryen's hatchling, it seems highly likely Septon Barth may once again be correct,
it seems his hypothesis of blood magic and genetic alteration may very well be the case for the origin of dragons. As interesting as Lena Targaryen's hatchling was in Fire and Blood, that was not the only smoking gun to be found. If you recall, it is said Valyrians claimed they themselves descended from dragons, and were kin to the ones they now controlled. Now, after understanding there is a pretty good chance dragons were created through blood magic and sorcery, and accounts of Valyrian blood mages experimenting mightily, and of Gogossos, where it is said slaves were mated with beasts to create monstrosities, well, there may be some truth to the Valyrian claims of possessing the blood of the dragon. As it turns out, this second smoking gun in Fire and Blood came in the form of the curious case of Aerea Targaryen, the very incident that ignited Septon Barth's curiosities, which led him to write A Natural History. For those who haven't read Fire and Blood, Aerea Targaryen was a young Targaryen princess who had resolved to run away from home. But instead of hopping on a bus or going to stay with a friend, Aerea claimed Valyrian as a mount, disappearing without a trace. She remained missing for almost a year, and according to the text, no one knows where she went. But according to Barth, all clues pointed toward the smoking ruins of Valyria. When Aerea returned to King's Landing, she was at the brink of death, and in the most critical of conditions. She landed near Maegor's Holdfast, where she slid off Valyrian and collapsed. Sir Lucamore Strong had been the one to carry Aerea to the Red Keep. Fire and Blood goes on to say this about Lucamore's encounter. Later, he would tell anyone who would listen that the girl was flushed and burning with fever, her skin so hot he could feel it even through the enameled scale of his armor. She had blood in her eyes as well, the knight claimed, and there was something inside her, something moving that made her shudder and twist in my arms. We would later learn from Septon Barth's testimony on the matter what those things were twisting inside Aerea. The things, Mother have mercy, I do not know how to speak of them. They were worms with faces, snakes with hands, twisting, slimy, unspeakable things that seemed to writhe and pulse and squirm as they came bursting from her flesh. Some were no bigger than my little finger, but one at least was as long as my arm. Oh, warrior, protect me, the sounds they made. They died, though. I must remember that. Cling to that. Whatever they might have been, they were creatures of heat and fire, and they did not love the ice. In response to these accounts, there has been much talk and speculation throughout the fandom on what had befallen Aerea and what these worms could be. Luckily, there is a general consensus on the matter because, well, there aren't a lot of options for what things called creatures of heat and fire could be. Really, there are only two options, and those options would be firewyrms, or a hybrid variation, as they are described as worms with faces and snakes with hands. From Barth's accounts of Aerea, these claims of Valyrians descending from dragons may very well hold remnants of truth, because we see Aerea's worms and how her body was able to accommodate these creatures, and we naturally begin to question things. As Septon Barth puts it, what befell her on Valyria I cannot surmise. Judging from the condition in which she returned to us, I do not even care to contemplate it. The Valyrians were more than dragon lords. They practiced blood magic and other dark arts as well, delving deep into the earth for secrets best left buried, and twisting the flesh of beasts and men to fashion monstrous and unnatural chimeras. For these sins, the gods in their wrath struck them down. So, after understanding the link between firewyrms and dragons, and taking into consideration the possibility that Valyrians may also in some sense share the blood of the dragon, let's take a moment to examine the deformities seen in the occasional Targaryen dragon babies. According to the World Book, Maegor the Cruel was plagued by infertility, and what children did result from his many marriages were described as deformed monstrosities, said to be mishapen, eyeless, limbless, or having the parts of man and woman both. In fact, Fire and Blood retells that his child with Alice Haraway had twisted limbs, a huge head, and was born eyeless. His child with Jane Westerling was reportedly a legless and armless creature, possessed of both male and female genitalia. And Queen Eleanor delivered a stillborn child, described as an eyeless boy, born with rudimentary wings. So, taking into consideration the fireworm deformities seen in Lena Targaryen's hatchling, when we examine the children of Maegor, we see a child without eyes and limbs, in addition to rudimentary wings, and possessing both male and female genitalia, which also happens to be very reminiscent of Barth's other pearl of wisdom of dragons being neither male nor female. And when we look at how Maegor's difficulties are described, we see another hint. Maegor was cursed, men said. He had slain his nephew, made war against the faith and the High Septon, defied the gods, committed murder and incest, adultery and rape. His privy parts were poisoned, his seed full of worms. The gods would never grant him a living son. Of course, Maegor was not the only Targaryen to conceive such children. When we examine Daenerys' child Rhaego, we see many of the same descriptions. Twisted. I drew him forth myself. He was scaled like a lizard, blind, with the stub of a tail and small leather wings like the wings of a bat. Twisted, scaled like a lizard, and blind, with a stub of a tail and wings like a bat. And this description echoes not only the children of Maegor, but also echoes the deformities seen in the stillborn Visenya, the daughter of Queen Rhaenyra, a child described as twisted and malformed, with a stubby, scaled tail. Now, with taking into consideration the evidence at hand, it seems very likely there may be truth in the hypothesis of wyverns being crossed with fireworms. But in addition to this, the claims of the Valyrian people possessing the blood of the dragon and being kin to the ones they controlled may also bear some weight. However, even with all these new details in Fire and Blood supporting these origins, there is one slight problem. Despite the evidence supporting Valyrian blood magic and the creation of dragons, there is evidence to suggest dragons existed even prior to the founding of Valyria. The Valyrians had a very specific building technique where they would use dragon flame to create fused stone. It's an incredibly hard and durable material that leaves no hint of any joint or seam. And there just so happens to be two very large pieces of evidence to suggest a much older civilization had first developed this technique. If you are familiar with the World Book, it describes something in the Far East called the Five Forts, a line of hulking ancient citadels located along the northeastern border of ET. Certain scholars from the West have suggested Valyrian involvement in the construction of the Five Forts, for the Great Walls are single slabs of fused black stone that resemble certain Valyrian citadels in the West. But this seems unlikely, for the forts predate the Freehold's rise, and there is no record of any dragon lords ever coming so far east. The World Book then goes on to retell that the Five Forts are impossibly old, and are believed to have been raised by an ancient and mysterious civilization known as the Great Empire of the Dawn, a period well before the founding of the Valyrian Freehold. Interestingly, there is also another impossibly old structure made of fused stone, and while the origin of this structure remains a mystery and a source of speculation to maesters, the fandom has come to a consensus that the source of its construction was also the Great Empire. The structure that I am referring to would be none other than the base of the Hightower on Battle Isle. More troubling and more worthy of consideration are the arguments put forth by those who claim that the first fortress
is not Valyrian at all. The fused black stone of which it is made suggests Valyria, but the plain, unadorned style of architecture does not, for the dragon lords loved little more than twisting stone into strange, fanciful, and ornate shapes. Within the narrow, twisting, windowless passages strike many as being tunnels rather than halls. Mayhaps this is no more than a defensive measure, designed to confound attackers, but it is too singularly un-Valyrian. Additionally, if you have been in the fandom for some time and have watched History of Westeros' episodes done in collaboration with Lucifer Means Lightbringer, they cover the Great Empire of the Dawn and Asshai, which I have linked below. You will also know there are several clues to suggest that Asshai, an incredibly old and mysterious city, was once most likely part of the Great Empire. What is interesting here is that in addition to architectural proof of dragons existing during this empire, there are also several tales recalling dragons originating long ago in Asshai, not Valyria. In fact, we learned this little nugget of information in the first book of A Game of Thrones, when Dany is talking with her handmaidens. Dany mentions hearing stories of the first dragons coming from the Shadowlands beyond Asshai and the islands of the Jade Sea. The World Book also mentions ancient tales from Asshai claimed that an unnamed people tamed the first dragons and brought them to Valyria and taught the Valyrians their arts before departing from the annals of history. When Aegon V became consumed for knowledge of hatching dragons, he quite possibly believed these tales as well and had commissioned journeys to places as far away as Asshai in search of dragon knowledge. So, it seems in addition to the architectural evidence of the Great Empire having dragons, there are also certain histories suggesting this origin as well. So now, with the evidence at hand, you can see the conundrum here. Was it the Valyrians who worked blood magic and sorcery to create dragons, as the evidence suggests? Or did the Great Empire of the Dawn first have dragons, as the evidence also suggests? There are answers to these questions, which we will address in Part 2, and in doing so, we will also be uncovering the origin of the Valyrian race, which may surprise you. Well, that about wraps things up for today. A special thank you goes out to the patrons who support this channel on Patreon. Your support has been incredibly appreciated and encouraging. Our next video should be out in the next 3 weeks, so be sure to hit the notification bell to receive notifications.
If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching!